Hi, welcome back. We are now joined by two other Calestous Juma fellows. The first one, he's also making a comeback, is Dr. Yaw Bediako from Ghana. He is the co-founder and CEO of Yamachi Biotech, and he'll quickly tell us more about that if you haven't listened to our previous episode on Connecting the Dots podcast. And then we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Nicki Tiffin, who is based in Cape Town, South Africa at the University of Western Cape. And she's the Deputy Director of the South African National Bioinformatics Institute. And she'll also touch a little bit about health data, as we've heard from our previous speakers, of the importance of research on this continent. Yaw, our previous fellow.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Clearly, I didn't do too badly the first time. So you invited me back, although you have new digs. So this is cool.
Yeah.
Very briefly, Yamachi is a life science research company primarily interested in oncology, or the study of cancer. And our take is, we are trying to diversify cancer research. Majority of cancer research historically, and to be honest, even now, is primarily been based around research done in people of European ancestry, primarily because most of it has been conducted in Western Europe, North America, to some extent now in Asia. But the data that we have available to us to develop new drugs and diagnostics for cancer is over almost 80% people of European ancestry. Less than 3% of the available data is from people of African ancestry. And so what we try to do at Yamachi is grow the database from the continent. And we do this because Africa has the most genetically diverse population in the world. And so this is an opportunity not just to improve representation of African people in databases to improve medicines for Africans, but really it is an improvement for the globe. Because the more we understand about cancer across diverse population groups, the better our medicine is, the more likely we are to diagnose early, the more likely we are to treat people with cancer and prolong their lives.
Since you were here last on the podcast, what are the developments that Yamachi and yourself have experienced? And it was very enlightening for us to meet a young researcher at that, who's transitioned into biotech industry. So what highlights can you give us in terms of what you've been able to achieve so far?
Can you remind me what month was it we did that for?
I think it was maybe September, and I'm probably also getting it wrong, but I can't remember.
It was
maybe mid-year last year.
2024.
2024, yeah.
Okay, yeah, because
big things.
Life in startup, it's like you work in weeks. So, a lot has happened. Most significant is we've launched what we call the African Cancer Atlas. So as I said, Yamachi's vision when I co-founded the company and what we've been trying to do for all these years is how do we build up a sizable database that is big enough to be meaningful in the context of global oncology research? Because you need a certain volume for you to be able to have the power, statistical power for people to be able to use it for research. And the challenge has always been, where do you find the money to do this? Because this is not cheap to do. And so we've been building relationships, trying to build a network to have access to patients. I'm happy to report that in January of 2025, we launched TACA, or the African Cancer Atlas, as an initiative to ultimately build a database of 15,000 genomes drawn from cancer patients across the continent, which would be the largest cancer genomic database on the continent. And by the fact that it's across Africa, the most genetically diverse in the world. So we've launched this. We signed a partnership with Roche. So this is a partnership between tiny Yamachi, African biotech company, with a massive global biopharma company. So it's a very exciting time for us.
Yeah.
We hope it will be the beginning. The goal is to establish a consortium of big pharma companies who are basically providing resources to allow us to generate this data. But it's a commercial relationship, which I think is important because it signifies that you can get big international companies to actually pay to do R&D in Africa. It's not charity. It's not out of the goodness of their heart necessarily, although many of these people are good people. The real idea is this is commercially viable. And an important aspect, the final thing about TACA that is really exciting, is that we have negotiated for it to be open access to African scientists.
Oh, nice.
So Yamachi is a commercial company, but we have a heart for Africa and we are impact focused. And so what we've done here is structured a commercial relationship with a commercial entity where we are providing data as a service to Big Pharma, but Big Pharma also recognizing the importance of this data to the continent is not blocking us from making it freely available to African-based scientists. And the hope is this will catalyze research at our universities and research all over the continent to unlock, cancer research for Africa.
I mean, yeah, this sounds like a long time coming. When we speak about data, and especially given what's happened earlier this year, it sounds like you would have been saving the day when we are missing out on data, especially DHS data and things like that. Nikki, this is your field. So,
yes, it is. Data.
Data,
And I should add,
data.
Nikki has been instrumental in helping us think about our ethics. So I just want to,
Oh, that's true.
Nikki
we
has
have
helped
collaborated
us
on the ethics and governance because, of course, the kind of data I was talking about are very personal data, and they're very sensitive data. Health data really mean a lot to people. So one of the areas I do work in is the kind of governance and how we use data ethically. So it's been a great partnership. And I have to say, I'm super impressed with the really ethically sensitive and societally sensitive approach that Yomachi shows. So well done, Yaw.
Thank you.
Nikki,
yes.
Aside from the amazing Table Mountain in Cape Town, tell us about SANBI and what are the things that you're excited about doing?
Yeah, thanks. So the Bioinformatics Institute at the University of the Western Cape, it's the oldest bioinformatics institute in Africa.
Oh, wow.
It was one of the first ones.
How many years?
It was launched in 1995. It's a young science, bioinformatics.
Yeah.
And it's a field where we kind of process very big biological data. And it was kind of pushed into being because when we were sequencing the human genome and other species' genomes, we realized that the data were just growing and growing. And you could no longer just open a spreadsheet and kind of cast your eye out and do a few calculations. This was really large computational stuff. So bioinformatics is really the field of, and it's sometimes referred to as computational biology, is a field of using computers to do the research so that you don't change your research questions, but instead of going into a laboratory and running tests in test tubes on a lab bench, instead you are sifting through the data and working through the data using computational power and crunch power. But we still have the same end goal, and that is really at SANBI, we have a particular focus on health, using bioinformatics to push the health agenda across Africa. And that can be in sort of infectious disease research, looking at pathogens and the genomes of pathogens. And then I work generally more in the field of human genomes and how we can link human genomes together with other health data to try and better understand what makes people unwell in Africa. And working with, as Yaw said, we've got amazingly diverse genetic backgrounds in Africa because we have these ancient populations. And I always say it's my favorite joke, but actually the kind of rest of world populations genetically are just a very small, boring subset of Africans. So we've got a lot of work to do in that space. And it's one of the areas we like to work at SANBI. And like Yaw said, we really need African solutions for African health and wellness. What's done in the global north can be useful, but it's not really tailored to who we are and how we live in Africa.
Yeah.
So we're very interested at SANBI in pushing that agenda as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Nikki, that's an interesting thing how you're talking about, how research is done on the continent. It has to be for Africans by Africans. Earlier, your co-fellow or the Calestous Juma fellow, Isabella, was talking about how all researchers in Global North seemingly have a head start. What challenges, especially when it comes to data, what challenges do you face when you have to deal with data? Because I can't even begin to imagine when we're talking about governance and privacy. What are the challenges you're facing and how are you circumventing that or how are you trying to address it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there are several different layers to that. So I think the first layer is actually our healthcare client or our research participant. And actually the data that come from them belong to them, and we need to respect that. So there's a sort of global perception that somehow in Africa we're not able to make our own choices in a considered and intelligent way, and that's absolutely not the case. So I like to use a little meme and say, keep calm and just ask first.
Yeah.
So informed consent is a really essential part of how we use data. Have we explained to the people who are so generously giving their samples and their data exactly what we plan to do, how we plan to do it, how will we protect the data, how are we going to use the data? And it's one thing to inform them, but did they actually agree? And we need to be very specific about what people are agreeing to so that we don't misconstrue that and do something that actually those people might not really be comfortable with. So that's really putting the participant or the healthcare client right in the center of the picture from day one with data. But then we have some other challenges, and that is around data equity. And what do I mean by data equity? I mean that there's an uneven playing field, and I tend to generalize global north, global south. Obviously, I'm talking from an African lens, but I think some of the problems that we face in Africa are also faced by other global south kind of populations and research organizations. And that is the sort of historical flow of data and samples from Africa, from the global south, into repositories, into databases that sit in the global north. And actually, there's really no good reason why it has to be like this.
Yeah.
It's simply historical, and we've somehow accepted that status quo.
Yeah.
But actually, we have fabulous data and amazing capacity to do fantastic research. So it doesn't really make sense to ship everything out of continent, off continent, and assume that somehow we can't do the work here. We can. We have great minds. We've got increasing sort of levels of training. We've got people who are keen to do the work. So I think there's a mindset change which needs to happen and is happening, and that is to say that we should be leveraging what we have as Africans. We should be using it to benefit Africans. And we should be using African data to benefit the world. And maybe part of that is collaborating with people outside Africa, but we need to do it on an equal basis. And we need to make our amazing sort of human resources and our human data and the biospecimens that people give so generously to really benefit people on the continent as a priority.
Yeah.
And because we have this amazing diversity here, and we have such a huge array of contexts and environments, that really we can give answers that are globally relevant as well.
Nicki, I want to take you back when you talked about pathogen genomics. Can you just unpack that very quickly in 30 seconds? Because we have, members of the public who listen to the podcast. Sometimes that might not be clear.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I just have to give a disclaimer that I don't work primarily in pathogen genomics, but maybe that equips me well to explain it to people who also don't know about pathogen genomics.
Yeah.
So pathogens are microbes, our SARS-CoV-2 that caused COVID-19, the microorganism that causes tuberculosis or HIV. They're these incredibly tiny bugs or microbes, and they have a small genetic chromosome normally that carries all the information about that little tiny pathogen. And if we can understand the information in that DNA inside a pathogen, we can understand many more things about how does it infect humans or animals or whoever it's infecting, plants, and how does it make people ill, actually? And why do some people respond well and they don't get as sick, and other people have the same infection like we saw with COVID-19 and they get very, very ill? So if we can understand the biological drivers of pathogens and these infectious diseases, it makes it much easier to treat them because we understand the biology. But we can also use this information to do diagnostic testing and build very specific diagnostic tests. So it's about understanding the DNA that sits inside microbes and using that to better manage infectious diseases.
Yeah. I'm going to bring you back into the conversation and throw a curveball at you.
Oh,
Hutch, you are both here at the Evidence for Development Conference. And yeah, I don't know if you were sitting in the same room as I was. You know, they're having more than 50 sessions. But in one of the plenary rooms, I remember one of the speakers was saying that during COVID-19, you know, there was modeling and projection. This is looking at data. And somebody somewhere at the very start of the pandemic, went ahead and said, you know, the continent is going to be hit and we're going to have ridiculously amount of deaths from COVID. What are you doing differently when it comes to cancer and, you know, at Yamachi, making sure that you're collecting the correct data? You know, I'm super shocked by the 15,000, by the way. That sounds like a small number for a population of 1.5 million. I mean, how many cancer cases in Kenya alone do we have? So what are we doing to make sure we have accurate data that tells the right story? And then we're also now beginning to address the issues or the challenges we're having on the continent and do it very well.
No, I think the first thing is, I mean, with COVID, the models, you know, were perhaps based on expectations. Everybody was surprised by how fortunate Africa was when it came to mortality. In fact, some people are so surprised that they refuse to accept that we didn't die.
Hence your quotes.
And it's as if we can't count dead people. So, you know, I mean, I think it's almost insulting to the scientists in Africa that people still refute the mortality rates. But I think, and we're still trying to figure out why. I mean, youthful population, pre-existing infections. You know, there are a number of hypotheses. Exactly. So there are many, you know, so I don't think it was that the models were probably just overly simplistic, not taking into account the real diversity of factors that would affect mortality. So they were probably applying the European or American kind of data, extrapolating it to Africa and saying, well, they are poor, they won't have access to hospitals, so therefore they will die, without taking into account that it's a very different population you're talking about. Our average age is 19. In Italy, average age is maybe much higher. 70s. So, you know, so I mean, a lot of those things. You talk about the 15,000. I mean, part of the reason, so genomics is interesting. Genomics requires different amounts of data depending on the question you ask. So if you are looking at broad population level studies, talk about what we call genome-wide association studies. These are massive studies, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, where you're looking for associations between specific genetic traits and diseases, or genetic variants and diseases. But sometimes, if you narrow your question, then you need less data. Right. So if you know what you're looking for, it's a bit like a needle in a haystack, but at least if you know where in the haystack to look, then you maybe need a slightly less hay than if you have no idea where in the haystack to look. So with cancer, good analogy, it allows us to be a bit more targeted. So even in the West, like the gold standard NIH database for cancer, the Cancer Genome Atlas, which has admittedly unlocked huge discoveries in cancer, is 22,000 genomes. Right. So just to answer your question about 15,000, 15,000 is a pragmatic number because it took the NIH 10 years and $370 million to generate TCGA. We want to do it in 3.5 years and on obviously a much smaller fraction of that budget. So, you know, there's a little bit of pragmatism, but I think based on what we are doing, you know, we are confident that at least for a start, we would have enough data because we will be very focused. So we'll limit ourselves to certain types of cancer that are prevalent in Africa, not cast too wide a net, so that you don't dilute. You know, you have 15,000 divided by X number of cancers, it ends up being too few per cancer type. So I think the thing with data is it's important to know, to decide almost a priori what you hope to achieve. And I'm not a data scientist. Nicki is probably much better placed to talk about this. But as a scientist, we like to work with hypotheses. And I think for those going into genomics as a business, if I can pivot slightly, genomics is a huge opportunity for Africa because of our diversity. It's, in my opinion, it's more valuable than any of the natural resources that we have. Meaning genomics, because our genomes are central to the human race, genomic data in Africa should be central to medicine. In fact, the moment they invented a sequencing machine, they should have moved one to Nairobi or moved one to Accra or to Lagos and started sequencing Africans. Instead of spending all hundreds of millions of dollars sequencing Europeans over and over again. But now that the world has realized that, there is a shift. Now, of course, we have to be careful when you talk about commoditizing genomes and what does that mean for the people. And that's areas that, you know, Nicki and actually I am also very interested in.
Governance.
But it represents a massive commercial opportunity for Africa if we can structure it right in such a way that it will benefit our countries, our people, and global science. Now, the key part of that is if we are to take advantage of this opportunity, we need to do it in a scientifically driven way. There have been attempts in Africa, one notable one, I won't mention the company's name, that went into the genomic space in a big way a few years ago, and unfortunately did not succeed. Now, there are many reasons perhaps why, but one of the main reasons was you must not oversimplify the science. So for young entrepreneurs, whether it's in genomics, whatever it is you want to do as a scientist in business, you need to explain your business, your science in a way that investors who are not scientists might understand, but do not make the mistake of yourself oversimplifying it. So you find a way to explain it in a palatable way to the general public, but on the back end, you are keeping your scientific rigor. Basically, don't drink your own Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
And I think with data and genomics, that is imperative, because even in America, there are examples of companies that had huge amounts of money and have since not done very well because they thought, oh, genomes are great, we're going to generate genomes. But then what are they going to use the genomes for? For drug discovery. What is the data you need in addition to your genome to make the drug discovery work? They didn't ask those questions. So they have 5 million genomes and now they're bankrupt because even though they signed some very lucrative deals with pharma, in the end, pharma was like, it was a poor investment because we didn't get anything out of it.
No return,
we spent $300 million to buy your data and we got nothing.
Yeah.
Or we buy a huge amount of data and then when we pass it out, we find that it's only a tiny little bit of it that we can use. So even in America, they've made such mistakes. We in Africa cannot afford to do that. So I think that is the key thing is try as much as possible to at least think of what the data will be used for, and then try and think of all the factors that might affect how that data is interpreted. And then design your experiment, design your business, design your research project in the most rational way. That's how we do science.
Yeah.
The problem is when you come into business, there's hype, there's speed, there's all the pressures to be flashy. And sometimes you forget that. I think it happens in research too. You know, you're trying to get that grant, you use the buzzwords, you know the funder wants. It's really not in line with your scientific plan, but you kind of skew it. In business, the pressure is even more. So just from the genomics angle, it's an opportunity for Africa. But if we oversimplify it and don't have enough scientific rigor, meaning don't work with enough of our African scientists, you will fail.
I mean, I want to take you back to the plenary session that you had earlier in the morning. Nicki, you were there. And I seem to remember he mentioned that, you know, a conference of that type, you know, Evidence for Development conference would be, you know, organized by philanthropy, private sector, not NGOs as we have seen here. In your opinion, do you think we need to do more to engage the private sector and industry, you know, as a solution to health research and maybe R&D, strengthening the R&D ecosystem? You know, are we approaching this all wrong? Yes, you have this conference where you want policymakers and researchers and innovators to discuss, but maybe we need to extend it further and bring to the table other players.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I will admit that I didn't think 5 years ago, I probably didn't have this perspective because I was very focused on academic science. That was what I knew.
You've evolved.
But I've evolved, and I've evolved because I've branched out a little bit. And now I'm beginning to understand things from a different perspective, maybe a rounded perspective where, you know, and I think the problem is we view science, primarily in Africa still, even the general public, view science as an academic endeavor. We view it as knowledge generation for the sake of knowledge generation.
Right.
That is only part of science. The cell phones we use, the cameras that are videoing us, everything around us is science, right? And it's science that has been applied and translated into a product. So whether it's the mics or our smartphones or vaccines or medications, it is science in action. And in Africa, we need to see that. When we think of the big tech giants, when you think of Samsung, you think of Google, you need to realize that not that long ago, it was a bunch of nerdy-looking scientists who developed the first prototypes that have now been made all nice. You know, the best example is a company like Apple. You had Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was the computer scientist who built Apple. Steve Jobs was the designer who made it beautiful.
Yeah.
Right? But without Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs would have had nothing to sell.
Yeah.
So science we need to think of science as the sort of the feedstock or the raw material of products. And so when you come to a conference like Evidence, EVI for Dev, what is the dev we want? We want development, which means we want money in people's pockets. At the end of the day, development is about economic development.
Yeah, right.
Right? How do people get money? They get jobs. How do companies give people jobs? They set up business, they sell something, right? So, and how do people give philanthropy? They make money and then they create a fund, right? Bill Gates started Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
It's Microsoft, the result of Microsoft money that we have the Gates Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So it all starts with creating a product. So I think, and products are created or products are pushed in the private sector. Government's job is to provide social services and a safety net for the populace. There are certain minimum standards that society needs to have, and that is government's job. Government's job is also to regulate, to ensure that business does not exploit people.
Yeah.
But government's job is not to create the next iPhone. Government's job is not to create a space rocket, right? Even in the US, NASA now, SpaceX went and brought those astronauts back, right?
Yeah.
So there is room for government involvement in R&D. But when the time comes to make it viable commercially, that is where private sector comes. So Africa needs to completely change the way we think about science. You cannot have a meeting like this about the private sector. Now the question is, where is the private sector? We actually don't have much of a biotech private sector.
Really?
Yes, we don't. We have pharmaceutical manufacturing. They do primarily generics.
Yeah.
Right? So that's great. Generic drugs.
Yeah.
So that's great because they lower the cost for the local market. But it's a low margin business because they get the raw material from India or somewhere else. They package it into syrup or tablets and then they sell it locally.
Yeah.
That is pharmaceutical manufacturing. They don't do R&D. They're not trying to develop the next malaria drug. They are waiting for the next malaria drug to be developed in India, and then they will bring it here and white label it and sell it cheaper. That is good. I'm not besmirching it. We need those components. But that is not the high margins. The IP is with that Indian company that developed the malaria drug. So when we say we want to engage with private sector, I've heard it at every meeting I've gone to for the last 2 years. They're not there. They're not there partly because the private sector we have don't do R&D. Mm-hmm. So they have very little interest in talking to people like Collen and I.
Yeah.
What we need to ask ourselves is, if we don't have them, then how do we create them? How do we create an environment where there will be 10 Yamachis at meetings like this? Mm. So I think we need to acknowledge that biotech private sector in Africa is practically zero.
Yeah.
And then for the few that are there, we try to bring them to the table. But more importantly, we are intentional about creating an environment that will allow these companies to rise so that they can come to the table. But till we do that, we'll keep saying private sector don't come. But if you invite chemists and pharmacists to come to an R&D meeting, they have no interest. That's not their business model.
And I mean, Nicki, thank you, Yaw. For you, just broadly, Yaw's been talking about the conference itself and now inviting other players. What was your take? What were highlights that you heard and they sounded very interesting to you, and others that you questioned?
Yeah, it was a very interesting meeting, obviously. I think that I'm hearing a shift in the conversation away from what we ought to do and much more about what are we going to do. Mm-hmm. And that's a big step forward. Less about what's wrong and more about what we need to do. I think it's really important that we start actually having a to-do list out of these meetings. That's what I'd like to see, like some very concrete action items that will take us forward. And I think, it's interesting listening to Yaw because he's talking about this disconnect between research and the sort of commercial sector and biotech sector. And I sometimes feel there's a disconnect between research and health service delivery on the continent. I think that sometimes as researchers, we lose sight of the fact that the primary aim is actually to get people healthier. Mm-hmm. I'm talking obviously about in the health research sector, which is the area I work in. And I think that at these meetings, we have an opportunity to bring together the policymakers around health and get them talking together with the researchers so that the researchers come out of their ivory towers and maybe the government's sort of ministries and policymakers can get some understandable insights into what the researchers are proposing. So I hope that this trend will continue of actually bringing the different sectors together and trying to get past research sitting out on its own, on a limb on its own. And I think, in my world, I often see people in bioinformatics who say they're doing bioinformatics for public health. And actually, we're not. We're doing research for health delivery.
Yeah.
We're not doing public health, and we're not doing service delivery. So in a way, I think if people can step out of their comfort zones, if researchers can be at meetings where there are people from other sectors and vice versa, maybe, we need to know what we can do, but we also need to know the things that we don't know, right?
Yeah.
And the only way we can do that is by meeting with people who do know the stuff we don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that the research sector, certainly that I've moved in, still has to learn.
And so as we are wrapping up, maybe in short, I don't know if both of you have responses to this. Nicki, you've said maybe we should have a to-do list. I want to be a bit controversial and say maybe we should not have a to-do list. You've talked about the disconnect between maybe research here and health delivery. And I'm beginning to think, even for me, a conference of this nature, you suddenly realize the siloed way of how we all work. And maybe it needs somebody to sit down and say, I need to just begin to convene, to bring people together, to make our systems efficient, more effective, essentially doing more with less. But I know Yaw is going to object to this, especially with this point of we are a rich continent beyond our natural resources, even if you just look at our human talent. So I don't know what your take is on that point.
No, I actually wouldn't push back on that. We need to do more with less. I think in Africa, we like to point to these, our resources, our demographic dividend, our young people. I mean, we romanticize Africa. And, since I've become friends with Collen, I love Collen. Like Collen always says something, we need to be realistic about where we are. And not, once again, it's like drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
It's fine when you go talk to the development partners, romanticize Africa because you want them to invest.
Paint that beautiful picture.
But when we are home, let's just be honest. Like, things are not that good.
Yeah.
People are rioting in Kenya for a reason.
Yeah.
People are dying in our hospitals. Our systems are broken.
That's true.
Our presidential convoys are 80 Prados long, and people cannot afford dialysis care in Accra. So I think, on the one hand, we want to provide this Afro-futuristic view to the world, but we need to be honest with where we are, because you cannot solve a problem till you acknowledge it. So we need to have a baseline setting. Like, these are the areas, not to moan about, because we're also very good at moaning our problems.
Yeah.
Not to moan about them, but to identify where can we make small incremental changes.
Yeah.
But then focusing on the big win. So it's not just casting our gaze down and not being ambitious, but taking a first step. So what are the immediate things that we can perhaps tackle? Can you, put one step in front of the other and keep moving forward? But from a position from a realistic position. Now, you know what? African science, if it was as brilliant as we claim it is, we would not have the problems we have. So yes, we say human talent. It's very difficult for me to find the talent I need for Yamachi in Africa. I'm not saying they're not Africans. They are not here. Right? So if I want to recruit, right now I'm recruiting for an NGS, a next generation sequencing technologist. We get hundreds of applications. Not one of them has ever sequenced. They've read about it in books.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a small company. I don't have the time, the energy, or the resources to teach. If I did that, I'll be at the university. I want somebody who can hit the ground running and sequence 100 whole genomes within a week. Those people I cannot find. We're getting applications from India. Okay. So we need to be realistic about the limitations. We have great potential. There are young people who have all the drive and all the inherent skills to succeed, but they need training in the technical areas that we have. And the problem is you train them and then they'll leave, right? So I think we need to be realistic about where we are and then make very strategic efforts to solve these problems. So, Singapore is a great example. In 2000, the country decided we want to be a hub for biotech. And so the government put in place a plan that involves strategic investments locally, strategic plans to make them business friendly, to attract international investment from all biopharma around the world, emphasis on talent creation, so investing in the academics, and then basically creating people that pharma will need. So saying we need NGS, so then you have a program in NGS and you put sequencing machines there and you just churn out these people. So strategic moves. 25 years later, there's hardly a bigger center for biotech in the world. They're a tiny country.
Yeah.
I mean, they're practically a city, right? And yet there's any big biotech company in the world, pharma company, has a presence in Singapore. I think it's worth $7 billion now. That is a strategic attempt by a small country to make investments, to say, we don't want to just be known for, technology and electronics. We want to be a biotech hub. Africa needs to do the same. Strategic investments, a clear plan, and then we hold ourselves accountable. Not document 10 years later, we haven't achieved it, then we create another one, and we don't even have a workshop to understand why we didn't create it, right? I mean, that frustrates. It's like we have so many documents, I won't mention them, the names, but we don't achieve our milestones, and then we just create new milestones and kick the can down.
And this is precisely my point about not having a to-do list.
Let's have a strategy and then say, okay, we are at this point of the strategy, and then this is phase 2 and phase 3, and then put money behind it, right? So
I would not be surprised to become the president of Ghana. Yeah, Nikki?
Yeah, so I think I'm agreeing with Yaw actually when I say to-do list. And I guess by that I mean we need a focus.
Yeah.
So I often talk about the fact that we have a parallel health data ecosystem for research that is separate to our clinical care kind of environment and our health data ecosystem for clinical care. And I actually think if we just put our kind of resources together and we fixed health data for clinical care and digitalizing health data, actually the knock-on effect from that is that we'd have all this magnificent data for research and for monitoring and evaluation, surveillance, etc., that would arise from the fact that we had fixed data for healthcare. So I think we need to pick strategically something practical that we can do and focus on and do well, but it needs to be the right choice that will have this long-term, sort of positive impact down the line, instead of trying to do everything at once and not doing anything well.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
No, I think I agree 100% with Nikki. And I think when I think about what we do wrong, we pick very big problems, and then we want malaria or child and maternal health, and then we'll design programs around those big themes. Those are themes. They are not actually specific problems.
Yeah, like preeclampsia.
Deliverables.
They are not deliverables. Yeah. Like what Nikki is describing is digitization of health data in Africa. So you could come up with a policy to create an institution that would handle that. And then you'd have clear KPIs of whether you're doing it. Mm-hmm. You could pick, like what Singapore did, like a biotech accelerator program. Mm-hmm. Then you say, okay, Nairobi, Lagos, Abidjan are going to be the hubs. We're going to put centers there, and we're going to have 3 companies in each place. How many companies do we have this year? How many companies do we have next year? The solution, the theme is biotech development in Africa, but targeted, it is hubs. It is an accelerator, right? So I think we need to get away from these big themes that are almost cliched sometimes.
And totally overwhelming.
Yes, and pick targeted...
And also top-down.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah. Targeted, well-defined problems that when you stitch them together, will solve the theme. So by the end, we'll have better maternal health because we've targeted breast cancer, and not even diseases. Like we've targeted structural issues that are there that we can make it sort of do in a tangible way.
Prenatal care, antenatal care, proper tracking of patients.
Yeah, so like tracking of patients could be one.
Yeah.
Right? So instead of that will end up dealing with some of the issues you have, but you'd have a structure. Right. You'd have a digital system. And we did it for COVID. I mean, COVID, you could get a COVID test certificate in every African country, and it was linked to a central system.
Yeah.
It was a centralized African Union initiative or whoever, right? I forgot what we called it. But all the certificates were standardized. So each test center was accredited.
Yeah.
That was across Africa, and we did it in a matter of months. So why can't we do that for some of the other things? Instead, lofty goals, and then we'll have meetings, and then more meetings.
On that point about a crisis, your panel, really, your highlight was you should never let a crisis go to waste. So on parting shot, we've come to that time where the podcast has to end, and I'm seeing the conversation is getting very heated in a good way, positive way.
Yeah.
Nikki, we are currently in a crisis, perceived crisis.
Yeah, so I think we have a
well?
health crisis, and I'm going to come back to my very boring, stock phrase, and that is, let's digitalize health data for continuity of care, and let's do it properly. So I think if we could put together even a blueprint of how you do this, that African nations can take, they can adapt to their context, but it's like a how-to. It's like a set of instructions, how to digitalize your healthcare data.
Yeah.
I think that would, change the face of health and wellness in Africa radically. So that's my one to do that I'm putting out there and saying, let's do that thing.
And I like the way you're being humble about it. Anyone listening would think that it sounds very hard to do, but you are well.
Yeah, it's been done. It's being done. We can do it.
Yeah.
There's definitely no reason why we can't. We could have a think tank of people who are doing it, have done it on the continent, put together a roadmap. If you want to digitalize health data, this is where you start.
Right.
And start facility by facility. Don't start by saying we're digitalizing healthcare for the nation. Say, okay, we're starting with these 3 hospitals. We'll roll it out there.
Right.
And then develop it from there. So it's a bottom-up approach with guidelines from people who know how to do it, not policy people who wish that people would do it somehow. Yeah.
Yaw?
Well, I'm glad, because I'm not the most radical person on this panel today. So it's great. I should do go with Nikki all the time. No, I agree 100%. I mean, I am obviously always, my sort of people are tired of hearing me talk about revenue generation. Science in Africa needs to start making money. And even with what Nikki described, as she was talking, I was like, find an ethical way to commercialize that, because that data is valuable. People have been harvesting our data since we were colonized.
Centuries, yeah.
Okay? And people have built empires on African data. It's time Africa began to benefit from its own resources. So can we tie our science and these initiatives to sustainable, ethical, commercial initiatives where we recognize commercial opportunities both domestically and internationally and position ourselves to be a player in the market, so that you are creating these programs, but you have sustainability in mind. And your sustainability is not securing another grant, whether from your government or from a foundation. Your sustainability is being able to, in 5 years, be self-sufficient, so that your data platform or your startup is generating revenue and is paying its own bills and is expanding. And it's basically iterating and scaling. I think that has to be the focus. And if we decide we're trying to do that, then it provides clear to-dos for many stakeholders. Mm-hmm. How are we handling, breaking down barriers across the continent? We're talking about the scale of Africa. It's very difficult to move anything in Africa, even data. Right? Everybody is so nationalistic about their data, and yet together our data is worth more. So how do we create these systems that recognize national sovereignty, but then also bring this Pan-African spirit and opportunity, right? It's not necessarily easy, but we need to start working on that pathway. How do we get stakeholders to, governments to invest strategically to build this infrastructure? Because they'll see, there could be a return on that investment. How do we attract foreign investment into it? How do we get funders and philanthropists to begin to change the way they think, not just in projects, right? Or, like I said, these themes, but to begin to almost give funds to make themselves obsolete, right? And give funds to people and hold their feet to the fire. Say, we're not going to be here in 5 years to give you more money. Yeah. So part of your sustainability plan is how this is going to be self-sustaining.
Yeah.
Force people to think sustainably, because too many of us as African scientists, our sustainability plan is I'll apply for another grant.
Yeah, right.
And Donald Trump is changing that.
He's changed that.
So I think we need to have a clear plan towards sustainability. In my view, sustainability is find your own money. Where does money come from? It comes from business. So can you find a way to link it to some sort of commercial, not losing your rigor and your research interests? And some of you, not everybody will become a business person, but there needs to be a link. And that way, gradually, our ecosystem will build, become more viable, and ultimately will stand on its own. And then we can begin to talk about Africa we want.
Yeah, that's a really good place to stop at, Yaw, by using the phrase or sentence from Agenda 2063
I've been well
of the Andean
trained.
Union. I see that. Yes, we have been talking at the conference Evidence for Development on realization of the African Union Africa We Want, which is Agenda 2063, specifically looking at STISA 2034. If you haven't seen these two documents, you're African, you have to look at them. I want to really thank and appreciate your time, Professor Nicki Tiffin.
Thank you so much. It's been
Yaw
a pleasure.
Bediako, and also your previous fellows, Professors Isabella Oyier and Collen Masimirembwa. We really appreciate your time. If you need to find out more information about Evidence for Development Conference, please have a look at their website, EV4Dev, or look at the CTD Pod Africa social media platforms. I've been your host, Juliet.